Welcome everyone. So this is a public SIG Node related meeting to discuss requirements, issues, goals, blockers to try to promote what we have today in Kubernetes CRI from an alpha API status to a beta and eventually GA form. Renal and I had been chatting a little bit last week, and Dims, I don't know if Dims is here today, around what we can do to try to evolve the present status quo of SIG Node having, the in-tree Docker shim, which I think as a community we would recognize has been largely put under maintenance, versus where a lot of both community and vendor adoption has shifted towards using the CRI implementations in practice. And so we kind of have the CRI in this quasi, it's alpha, but everyone treats it as production level status. But that is both good and bad, I guess. So it's good in that I think many of us represent users who've been using a CRI implementation in production now for well over probably a year, which means we've learned enough now to say what we'd want to tweak before we kind of declare a cut point and say how it gets to beta and GA. And maybe for that one, I'll pause and if there are folks on the call who represent CRI authors versus consumers, maybe we can get folks to share their current perspective on the API and what challenges may or may not exist that they feel are blockers. And so, Mrinal, since you organized this meeting, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, sure. So I think, Derek, it may be helpful to give an overview on what it means, like when we move from alpha to beta, like what can we do after we reach beta? Is it okay to keep adding? What's already there is kind of frozen. So if you give that perspective, it'll be easier.
Yeah, so my perspective on that one is just my perspective, right? So I'm happy to hear others feel differently. My perspective was part of the reason we developed the CRI itself. Like the motivation was we wanted to have an interface that met the need of Kubernetes at that particular release, right? So in the early days of containers, we had a fast-moving container runtime, fast-moving orchestration service, and sometimes there was an impedance mismatch between what the orchestration platform desired and then what the container runtime met. Across many dimensions, right? Sometimes the runtime was ahead. So things like, I don't know, even user namespace remapping that we talked about this week might have appeared in the runtime before it was actually understood how it would be leveraged in the orchestrator. And so when I think about what it would mean to alpha to beta, I think the first question is like, what does a CRI version mean, right? And so for me, if I, through my perspective here is, I think if we go from an alpha to a beta, it's not like we would say this is CRI version 1.0. We would say this is the CRI definition to satisfy Kubernetes 1.20 or 1.21. And in the same way that we roll out feature gates within Kubernetes that says, hey, you have a feature that's now alpha, beta, or GA. If that feature evolution required of Kubernetes required an enhancement to the CRI protocol, I would expect that that evolution of that API would just map equivalent to the evolution of a Kubernetes version SKU. So for me, the idea would be you would recognize that CRI is a supported interaction protocol between the kubelet and a runtime, but the actual API definition of the CRI doesn't need to be n-2 SKU or n-3 SKU in the same way that we have with kubelets and API servers. It's more just a recognition that we have something tested in CI. As consumers, we signal to the community that this is the API we as a community are aligning against. and you can expect iterations of that API in the same way you expect iterations to Kubernetes. So like that versioning statement, I think, is the first thing we need to come to a consensus with as a community or a group. If people are comfortable saying a CRI version maps to a kubelet version.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. We like if we always tie the kubelet version to the CRI version and don't make any guarantees about backwards compatibility.
What is the story today for Kubernetes queue and containerd queue? Like do we have a list of supported containerd versions, or how does it work? I'm sorry.
Yeah, so
it may be like a newbie question.
No, that's great, Sergey. So like that's part of the tension I see with what CRI had intended to overcome, right? So we used to have to say with the in-tree Docker shim, we support Docker 1.9, 1.10, 1.11, 1.12. Like we supported 3 levels of Docker at a time, if I recall, during the early iterations of the project. The statement of do you support containerd or do you support insert anybody else on the producer side of a CRI, I would like to just completely disassociate from being the realm of responsibility of the Kubernetes project, in the same way that the CNI and the particular individual versions of a CNI provider are disconnected from like a key thing we think about, right? So it would be up to the containerd community to say, we conform to this particular version of CRI or not, or the cryo community or any of the other runtime implementer communities and variations.
Yeah, so in cryo, we are tying the version of cryo to the version of Kubernetes. So it's kind of, okay, 116 is 116, 117 is 117, and so on. Not so clear on containerd versioning, but like folks on the call from that community are should probably chime in.
I can speak for at least the Windows side, and for Windows and containerd, we are tying Kubernetes versions to specific containerd versions for now.
And at what cadence does containerd, actually a couple questions, like is the CRI presently embedded in the containerd release, or is it updated separately somehow? It used to be separate and then I thought it had merged.
It's integrated.
Okay. And so like, is there a tension to wanting to cut new releases of containerd to align with Kubernetes releases? And then if we think about forward evolution of the API, does that mean, if we think about it in terms of like alpha, beta, GA style feature gates and queued, when we roll something in an alpha phase, we've been pretty good as a community not saying something couldn't go to beta until it was kind of satisfied by ideally more than one CRI provider. And so I guess what I'm curious is like, is there a real tension here if we just tried to have a versioning scheme that aligned with Kubernetes versions?
I don't think I could speak. So I'm more been on the more runtimey side than the specific CRI integration for containerd, but I can say the project defines a release support scope where it's either a year or whenever the version of the kubelet or of Kubernetes that was out at the time is at end of life. So it's kind of whatever the max of those two is. And that's kind of how that's been defined. I'm not sure of any particular tension around that.
So that's backwards looking support though, not forward looking support, right?
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and then can't comment on the actual support, but I think to answer your earlier question about cry being embedded into containerd, we have been testing, you can build the complete set of binaries from containerd/cry and get the latest version of whatever cry API they have vendored into there, and also vendor in like a known version of containerd, or you can build from containerd, which will vendor in a known version of cry. And so for some testing, we've been building all the binaries from cry containerd to do some validation, and then waiting until those changes go into containerd for a release.
Okay.
And as somebody pointed out in chat, there's actually the README on containerd/cry kind of defines the Kubernetes versions that are and how the support scope works for that.
So I'm trying to think about, I'm not hearing major objections to the original spirit of the CRI, which was define a runtime interface that was needed for meeting Kubernetes needs, which meant the versioning was oriented towards Kubernetes in my view and not inverse. And so like, it seems like as a broader community, we've been successful with that to date. Some things have evolved since CRI itself was originally done, and DIMS isn't on here, but like the CRI itself now is externalized from the main Kubernetes tree for vendor dependency management and stuff. So things are simpler there. And so from a pure versioning standpoint, it sounds like going from alpha to beta or GA, we don't feel that there's a strong need to change our definitions of SKU or anything that right now, which is good to hear. And so then like the next level of question is probably, are there issues the community has faced with using CRI in production that we feel we want to close before moving out of our alpha state? And maybe to set some like historical context or thoughts on this, there had been gaps in the CRI definition for say how metrics were reported in its earlier iterations, and now the runtimes take on more of that responsibility. And some of the concerns around like dual metric collection and that type of thing, I don't think have borne out as being too impactful. But are there other issues that people have hit now that we'd want to raise as real blockers to their particular runtime implementation being competently used in production due to a gap in the API, I guess?
So I think one issue, like we have been using C-Advisor in production, and we did a quick test with our perf team and we found some regressions. So we are not sure whether it's the way we implemented it in Cryo, or it's just there is because the behavior has changed where kubelet is talking over the CRI to get the stats that has made it worse. So we need to investigate and get to the bottom of that.
Yeah, and then the other area I'll just call out here, and I don't necessarily view this as a blocker versus maybe a future evolution, is nodes with ever greater density of containers. I think we at Red Hat at least have had experience where there might be issues in the current CRI definition around supporting very large numbers of containers on a node. But I don't think they're necessarily innately blocking. We could always add better pagination or iteration concepts in the future.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think some users at Microsoft have wanted to have like paginated query operations. I don't think it's been a blocker. I think but it has been identified that as we go to like super scale, we might start running into some issues with that.
I have one concern, not really a blocker, but like an overall concern about the current state of CRI, is with duality of who owns what in terms of controlling the C groups on Linux side. So Kubernetes does some direct modifications, and when we have a runtime which does some modifications. So in my understanding, the CRI interface was actually supposed to be like the ultimate controller of like how the container is run. So Kubernetes shouldn't be assuming something and actually give a power to a runtime to actually create all we needed infrastructure, like the C groups hierarchy for the containers, setting all the limits and so on.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily share that view. But it's a fair piece of feedback, right? Like we didn't call it the pod runtime interface, right? It was the container runtime interface. And so dealing with things like more than one container in a pod and the NIC containers and all the discussions we had around sidecar containers and that type of thing. I don't think for today's discussion, I'd want to evolve the meaning or role or scope of CRI to say, how come you're not the entire, how come you don't handle all orchestration on a pod definition excluding storage? Maybe that's a future project we can take on in the SIG, but like for the scope of what CRI was today, I viewed it as the imperative API kubelet calls to invoke creation and destruction of a container.
But as you mentioned, like the things are evolved from the time the CRI was defined and actually the current implementation of alpha version. So practically this preparation of like VM-based runtimes, you really need to care about the sandbox creation. You really need to prepare the size of the VM based on all amount of the containers inside this sandbox, all the resources what is needed for those containers. Otherwise, well, it works, but I would say not in ideal case.
Yeah, I would say the CRI was more designed for like a traditional Linux container and not around some of the things that we've kind of made happen, like VM-based containers and stuff like that. And it kind of shows in the interface and how some of the shortcomings of the interface in terms of adding those kinds of things kind of stand out when you look at that stuff. But
yeah, so I guess Brian and Alex, like I plus one on those comments. I think the thing I fear is like part of this discussion is part of that symptom, right? Which is like CRI, what formed in what 2017, maybe 2016. My own memory is failing me, and by not defining like a checkpoint of progress, to some degree, we might have held back progress on those other areas. And so I don't see there necessarily being an incompatibility on us saying the CRI as a communication protocol between kubelets and runtimes is a recommended path forward for the Kubernetes project. And at the same time, we can evolve the definition of the CRI to expand use cases, let's say, be seen. In the same way that like people respected the protocol between the Docker API and kubelet as just the accepted thing to use, independent of any knowledge on how the Docker API was versioned and if the kubelet could take advantage of it. So I kind of feel like if we reach a checkpoint of saying CRI is now beta or GA, one, it can give a clearer signal to the broader user community, which is like, we could deprecate the Docker shim and have more users adopting runtimes like Containerd or Cryo that might be getting deeper investment, or any of the other VM-oriented ones that were discussed. But right now, like, we're kind of doing a disservice to the community by keeping it kind of in a quagmire. So my hope here is we can make a decision point to say we've reached satisfactory progress on something. We have enough user experience on something to say we're comfortable with this, but then that lets us then shift attention to like, what's the next thing after that, I guess, for things that we've learned on that. So
that's practically my question related to that. So if we call it beta right now, will we be able in this beta stage to evolve the APIs to expose a bit more information about the pod and container resources downwards to API to runtimes?
yeah, so I think the goal here, Alex, is, and it's unfortunate Dims wasn't able to join her if he is as a project, we want to stop giving any preference to a particular runtime engine and be able to clearly articulate that the Docker shim itself has reached a plateau of function, and that future iteration will get done through a runtime agnostic interface. And so like by moving the CRI to beta, it helps us remove the Docker shim from the core Kubernetes repo, clean up our dependency management within that repo, and signal to users that you should move to one of the broadly supported container runtime versions. And so really the motivation here is like, how do we clearly signal it's time to get off of the Docker shim? And that's partly why we're saying there's like an unknown or hidden truth here, which is this, like, I think the majority of commercially supported distributions have moved to a particular CRI choice. And there's like a cognitive dissonance in the open source community on maybe sending a wrong signal to stick with the entry Docker shim.
Yeah, I totally agree about the Docker shim, and like for our customers, what I'm talking with, my first comment is like, you're running with Docker shim, get rid of it, switch to Containerd or Cryo, and we do something. Mm-hmm. But again, deprecating Docker shim, it's one part of the story. The second part of the story, in beta stage, are we going to do any compatible or incompatible changes to CRI API to get the future like development of runtimes in this interface at all?
Yeah, I would definitely I will definitely assume that the API has to evolve to support the features we've talked about. So whether that's privileged container support in Windows or the user namespace support that was presented just in the last 2 weeks. All that would be saying here is that our energies to support those capabilities would be 100% directed towards doing it in ideally a forward compatible manner to the CRI, right? We don't want to just make it that the CRI will change so drastically that you have no one implementing it between particular versions of Kube. Like, I don't think that's a real fear. Versus we could definitely add new operations or new arguments to those operations to meet new use cases for sure. So it's not intended to be a sign that the API is fixed or you know, dead.
Yeah, it seems like going. I don't know what the difference between alpha or beta would be, but like especially like GA, where it's a declaration of backwards compatibility. Like Kube 120 is not going to break stuff that worked in Kube 119 or something like that.
So that's the part I think I don't necessarily agree, which is going GA would mean well, I largely agree with that. That's a fair statement, but it would mean that you'd be expected to upgrade your CRI implementation to keep up to pace with any feature that, say, a future version of Cube evolves. So I would still want to keep CRI versioning semantics tied to Cube itself. Otherwise, one of the main value propositions of the project itself would have been lost, which was have an interface that meets the needs of that present release of Kubernetes.
I thought of a potential CRI deficiency that I'd like to also bring up. And this is not entirely well formed. I haven't had enough time to think through this, but for Windows specifically, with Windows containers, the kernel version of the container that you're trying to start is very important. And all of the containers within a pod must be started with the same kernel version. And we are kind of struggling to figure out the best way to support, but you can also, with Hyper-V isolated containers, and so this may be digress into like the VM-based containers, but we have the ability to start different pods targeting different kernel versions on Windows. And with the CRI API as it is today, we're having a hard time kind of doing like list operations and understanding exactly which container images are on the machine, especially around multi-arch images, where a multi-arch image definition can have multiple image versions for multiple Windows containers that all target different OS versions. And we're kind of hacking around it with some by also passing around some annotations today. But it is something that I think as we mature kind of Windows support, we'd like to have a better story around. Just kind of that plumbing. And I know Windows is kind of breaking the expectations that you can start any container for the platform on like in any of the pods.
Okay. Trying to think about how to best approach that, right? Because like the expectation today is, maybe if I probe on that a little bit, do you have concerns with the kubelet acting as the garbage collector of truth or images?
Well, today it's like the kubelet issues the list, like list images command, and the list images command takes in a container image and a tag, or just the container spec. And if that happens to be a multi-arch image, the kind of the behaviors or kind of workflow around that is unknown. So the CRIs can say, yes, I have that image, but it may have the image for a different platform or like a different OS version. And so then when we move on to the, like either, depending on what the behavior is to either pull or skip the image, we could not have the image when we then move to try and start the sandboxes or the pods.
Right. So for pod A, you may want one platform architecture installed, and for pod B, you want different architecture installed, a different version, right? Like Windows 7 versus Windows 10 kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So usually what we have today is it's either, you know, it's Linux or it's not, right?
Yeah. And so today we have
like, do config maps and secrets work properly right now in Windows?
Yes, they do.
One of them, I didn't think like empty dir volumes, one of the volume types I thought was a gap, but.
I think that empty dir volume was added. I know that there's a deficiency right now around single file mappings in containers that I believe was addressed at the OS level with the Windows security updates or just cumulative updates that got released this month. I haven't had time to validate that. I will double check with empty dir, but I'm pretty sure that that's working for container D, but probably not for Docker shim or Docker.
Because some of what I'm wondering is like, are there gaps between what the kubelet can act as the primary node agent to keep health, right? Like to date, like we depend on the kubelet a lot to like manage disk, CPU, and memory for what it sees on the node. And I'm wondering if we can separate maybe CRI deficiencies from like other supervising deficiencies that kubelet outside of CRI might have on Windows that maybe we aren't all familiar with. And
Mark, sorry, Derek, I thought you were done.
no. So I was just thinking, when you think about image listing APIs, right?
Yeah. So on that front, right? So when initially I was involved in with the Docker for bringing list manifest, and that time we only had architecture and OS in an image image part of it. So I think instead of kubelet, it would be better from the Windows point of view if you add another field here in image spec itself that can help you identify these images.
That field is there. There's an OS version now.
Okay.
And so we can identify the different versions of the Windows Server releases with platform, AMD64, OS, Windows, and version, the specific kernel version that maps to that that release. And I believe that's just part of the OCI spec now. That's like Docker manifest will list all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So is
I'm
the
just
problem
trying to think how. Sorry, go ahead.
So
well, yeah. So like we have an example today where you might want to run the same. Well, you might want to run a container on like just Windows version. Let's just say like X and Y, and if you have a multi-arch image that contains an image for like Windows version X and Windows version Y, if you like with the way the kubelet is structured right now, it's the list image call and then the pull image and then run pod sandbox. And if it's a multi-arch image manifest, the list image call doesn't know which particular Windows version it needs to query, and then pull image doesn't really know which particular version it needs to pull into the node. So to work around this, I believe that there were some talks, and unfortunately it was between Justin Terry and Lantau from the CRI side, who are both no longer really involved in the project, but we've got annotations that get added to the list the list and the pull call, where we can specify the either the runtime handler name, and then containerd needs to do some mapping to that, or a particular kernel version to make sure that that list image call or pull image call kind of honors a particular OS version.
And that's working today, right? Or is it not implemented?
It's working today. It's kind of hacky and it's based on annotations and just like magic on both sides, but it does.
That's the standard pattern, right?
Yeah.
We'll try it out with an annotation if we like it, write a cap, and let's extend the CRI API to support the field directly, and that would still be backwards compatible, right? So.
Mm-hmm. I think it's working today with a forked version of CRI and containerd from some Microsoft folks. I think that there were some discussions about what it would take to move some of those changes into containerd that I think were kind of like motivated some more longer term or architectural decisions with containerd, and I think those conversations are still ongoing. Because I think containerd itself kind of assumes that there's one image store that's based on a single platform or architecture or OS version. And in order to more cleanly kind of plumb that all the way through, there's going to be some bigger changes needed.
Maybe if it's okay, we could pause for a second and go back to macro goals then, which is, as a community here, I haven't heard any objections to clearly signaling to open source software Kubernetes community users that we do seem to want to all steer our user community towards a CRI choice, right? Rather than signal usage of the in-tree Docker shim. I think as a maintainer community, we would like to focus on the CRI path rather than the in-tree Docker shim as a parallel, which I think many of us have trouble keeping together in our heads. And so from that standpoint, it doesn't sound like there's like any macro objections to promoting the API out of alpha, giving a clear beta statement on it. And if we think about DIMS's larger goal of clearly signaling Docker shim deprecation, like no objections on that one. And so maybe like we can think through like iterative API tweaks we want to make. And sounds like on Windows and image management, maybe there's a couple we could suggest, but maybe we could pause here and ask like, what are the mechanical steps we think we'd have to complete in order to move the CRI definition out of alpha to beta, and how many we feel really matter. And so like, even at the most basic level, like if we go to the API now and we see it, the API versions v1 alpha 2, just going through the steps of getting do we want to go through the steps of having v1 beta 1 forms, v1 beta 2 forms? Do we want to just go from a v1 alpha 1 to a v1 form, and then to mitigate the maybe churn that might be felt on the implementer side? Do providers or implementers of the CRI have a strong opinions on that?
So, Derek, if we move to V1 directly, then does it mean we have to be more careful about doing iterative changes, or maybe we should?
Maybe another way I could phrase this is, what would a beta period mean? All right, let me take a step back, right? The meeting was called
It's been
out.
in production for years. It's
Been in production. Should we just go straight to V1, right? And so,
I don't think that, Murnau, to your question, I don't think the process changes really, right? Because we're already in production with the API.
But what happens if we start making bigger changes like the one Alex is talking about, like changing the C group's responsibilities and stuff like that? Are we talking about a V2 then, or do we do a V1 beta 1 beta 2 to do some of these iterative changes before we go to V1?
So I think I think if we try to strip responsibility for, say, pod level C group management or pod level metrics gathering out of the kubelet into the remote interface, to me, that's a clear distinguishing point where it's not quite the container runtime interface, but more of the pod engine interface. And it would be a new effort, new activity that might want us to have a V2 version, right, of a protocol. But
Derek, a good example for this dual responsibility is huge pages. So kubelet is responsible to set all the things on the pod level, and the actual runtime does it in the container resources structure of the fields. So
actually, my memory is escaping on that one, Alex. I thought I had merged a change in 119 to allow you to do container level isolation of huge pages.
Isolation is one thing, but overall limits setting, it's still kubelet is doing it on the pod level.
Sure, but kubelet's doing it for CPU and memory on the pod level, and it's doing it at the quaz level. And so, like, in general, like if we talk about management of quaz getting handed off to a runtime engine outside of the kubelet, that's more than just container or even pod. It also then takes ownership of the quaz hierarchy itself and its relationship to the peer system services. Like it's a bigger problem than even just pod, right?
Yes, but on our hand, so we already have information about the pod creation in the CRI interface. That's one thing. And second thing, all these things we do in Kubernetes, it's only under Linux. On Windows side, we don't have anything of this. So why such duality?
I guess with all respect, Alex, I'm trying to think about not wanting to, I don't want to boil the ocean, I guess, here, right? It's like we have a current intersection point that we've had production usage on for well over a year by many parties that if we define that checkpoint, it doesn't prevent us from iterating or evolving moving forward, I guess. And so like, if the discussion though is like, what would be the difference between a V1 and V2 form? To me, like a clear one is if it starts to take on management of quality of service from a node to pod boundary, or even a pod to pod boundary, where right now the kubelet is taking on many of those responsibilities. And I think more is involved in that, honestly. If you have that discussion, then you start questioning, well, who should handle eviction and scarce resource management? And today that's the kubelet, right? And so like, I want to be careful on that discussion to say that's a larger thing to chew off, I guess, than.
Right, and then it would be up to the CRI implementers, the integrations, to decide if they want to support two APIs at once, or with two different service,
Yeah, and honestly, I'm not even sure it makes sense to do. And so like that's a level of discussion that like is probably bigger than this topic.
Right.
Yeah, it's bigger, but all my questions, what I was asking, it was more about if we do it as a beta now, do we have paths to evolve it in the future? So something like Ronald was saying, like, would it be V2 or would it be beta 2 or something?
I think if it's a breaking API change, it's already V2.
I think like before talking about that bigger example, I have like 3 smaller items like that we can quickly discuss. So one of them is charging image pulls to a pod sandbox, then C groups V2 and user namespaces. So where do these land?
So maybe we can, let's talk about them each in detail, right? So
Sure.
The image pool right now, it's kind of like probes, actually, as we talk some of these things. Some of the things are not charged where we want them to be charged. What is the gap you see right now on the CRI to get?
So we don't have the pod sandbox information as part of the image pool. So we'll have to actually, kubelet will have to create the pod slice and hand that information to us, like either all of the pod request or just the pod C group. So we can spawn exec a process inside that slice to perform the pull, to charge it to the pod user.
So we give you the pod sandbox config.
Do we in the image pool?
I'm looking at pool image request, and the third argument is pod sandbox config.
Okay, let me check.
But actually, that brings up a good point. Like, if there are discrepancies in where charges are happening, I think we would like these things to be charged within their bounding container as much as possible.
Okay, yeah, we do have that in already. So I think if anyone knows of the top,
It's just the original, Ronald. The
okay.
problem may come right later that it's not going to do another pull if the image currently exists, right, in your cache.
But only if the pod policy was always, right? And so
Yeah.
The existence check from node to then registry to say, pull again, that subsequent pull in an always case should still be fine going to the right.
At least in case of container, it will not pull from my experience. It will go to snapshotter and check if the blobs exist, and it will return.
Yeah, it'll only pull a manifest.
Yeah. It will only pull the manifest, and it will not pull the image again. At least this is in case of container.
Does it not check if you had authenticated access to that image?
Well, even if it's authenticated, only the manifest needs to be re-authenticated.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
The blobs themselves are right. So when it comes to charging, for who do you charge the megabytes against, right?
I think it's still okay. Like if the first user that is pulling the image is charged for it. So I guess Derek, then that's not really a gap. We just need to implement it in Cryo at least. I'm not sure if Container D is doing a pull inside of C group. Mike, do you know?
Yeah, no.
Okay.
It's only within the KDS.io namespace we'd have to do further isolation.
Okay.
And actually, if we just take a note, I think, Renal, you have a good list. I'm trying to look at the image pooler right now in Kubelet to verify we are actually sending it to you, even though it's in the API. So that's one to talk through. The second item you raised, I'm sorry, was
so C groups V2 changes, and I'm talking about the not converting case, where we want to figure out how the QoS will change and how your pod specs will how to change with all the changes in C groups V2, where we can take advantages of the kernel improvements in V2.
Thinking this right now, so for C groups V2, we have the code on the kubelet side that's doing the conversion between the cube resource model to the CRI model, which right now is C group V1 oriented. And then we're depending on the runtime to detect it's on a C group V2 host to then convert it back to a V2 form.
Yeah.
I think we're obviously limited on the resources we have there to just CPU memory and huge pages. I don't see a reason we couldn't evolve the current V1 form to have Linux container resources V2 in the current API that the kubelet would respect when it sees it's on a V2 host. I'm not sure if we have any complication where the kubelet would see it's on a V2 host and not want to send V2 resources, because the kubelet itself is also orchestrating V2 taxonomy. So from my perspective, we have C groups V2 in flight right now in kubelet. I would love to see an iteration on a CRI API definition that said I see I'm on a V2 host and we could just send V2 messages.
Yeah.
But if it's as simple as just doing Linux container resources V2 or adding the new V2 fields and only sending one or the other, that's fine too.
Yeah. So I think is that something that we can, if we call it V1, can we add on top, or it's better to do like a beta one and then add it, test it out before jumping to a final V1?
So the kubelet needs to support V1 hosts for a very long time moving forward, and V2 hosts in parallel, right? So I don't see a case where in Kubernetes we would say everyone must move to V2 now. And so it's a matter of kubelet's going to have to support V1 and V2 forms. And I think that might mean particular CRI implementations would have to support V1 or V2 forms, and the kubelet just calls the right one for what it sees as the state of the host.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I mean, no, I don't think like we have to move CRI to V2. It's just, I think my question is like, does that change any arguments one way or the other when like jumping from alpha to V1 or V1 beta?
No, because the way I think about that is then like any new secret V2 specific resource knob we would explore would be tied to some type of feature gate in Kubernetes itself. And so I don't see an issue in us being able to roll that out. I do like the idea of having just a Linux container resources V2. Part of the gap on that though is I thought we tried to keep everything aligned with the runtime spec, and we still need a V2 runtime spec.
Yeah, so on the runtime spec, we have the spec changes in, and like the runc changes are in flight. And then there are like some changes that have happened in the kernel, right? Like they changed how they're doing the kernel memory accounting. So what used to mean memory before in the pod spec means something slightly different now in V2 land. So it may make sense to make the user aware, like, okay, when you say 100 MB in V1, C groups V1, it's different than when your host is configured to be on V2. So from that perspective, do we ever think that we'll want to change the pod spec to ever expose the fact that we want to tune to V2, or we'll still want to do it under the hood and just explain the differences, that this 100 MB is not equal to this 100 MB?
I think we'd have to explain the differences. This goes back to like, we don't do kernel memory accounting properly still. So, and as you know, Mernal, like what gets charged to your C group varies based on just the knob on that syscontrol.
Right.
And so I guess I'm comfortable with the fact that we don't have every unknown solved, but maybe like if we wanted to stage getting C group V2 alignment with the latest state of the runtime spec in the CRI and have a Linux container resources V2 as a prereq in that API definition, that seems fine to me. But we can't reach to a state where kubelet's going to have V1 and V2 parallel support for a long time to come. Like that's even more controversial than runtime choice, honestly, to say how your OS
right.
version is.
Okay, so, but are you saying we should lock on that, Derek, or we should still have this one jump from alpha to next and then another jump to introduce a Linux?
I'd like to have as few jumps as possible that are as least disruptive as possible to recognize what feels like an accepted status quo now. So like, and for C groups V2 stuff, it seems like we could just update our Linux container resources to map what I see in the runtime spec. But I don't know if we'll get all answers in today's call, but like we've raised 3 topics, or at least 4, the Windows image listing. And we can iterate on that asynchronously. The third topic you raised was?
What was the user namespaces changes? Which are not as disruptive in my opinion. Like they still go into, if we broadly agree on having a pod security policy knob, then it should be okay.
Yeah, I don't see that.
No, I think we're sort of okay too, right? Even if it's going to change, it's going to change. We'll just change the the response code in the version tag, and Kubelet will know how to talk to us, right? In other words, when they first init, they're supposed to ask us what version of the API we're supporting. We can just say, and it's a semver as well. So if we decide that, version 1.0 has the capabilities that we've already validated, right, with no extensions, that's fine. And then if we add a new feature, we can just say, okay, that feature's in this particular version, and then we can respond with that tag when we've got it in that version of our implementation, right?
Yeah, I'm not too worried about that interface. I think that'll probably work out fine. I'm more worried about the evolution of the CRI versioning itself, and I think
and I think it's been the opposite from what I've seen. Right, we've been trying not to make improvements to the API so that we can get to GA. I think we're sort of stuck here. If we let's go ahead and GA this, and so we can get unstuck. Is what.
So, I want to be respectful of time, and actually, I need to know if I have to join something else. I think we've raised some clarity and consensus that there isn't major objections on providing a signal. I think there are about 3 or 4 small items that we can chase down asynchronously to say, do we think there is a backwards incompatible change? I think it's fair to say that if we declared a stable point, even if we said it was V1, yes, the kubelet wouldn't want to regress on that, but the community expectation would be that CRI implementers would still maintain versioning consistent with any evolution that might happen within a particular kube release, but we would not try to break backward compatibility, obviously, in the same way that we haven't to date. So maybe a couple of these items that were raised, the Windows one on image management, the 3 Mernal raised, if we can do some investigation the next day or 2 on what we would have wanted these to look like, let's get those identified. And then maybe next week we meet again to see if there were any other unknown unknowns met. And I guess the question I would have is do we feel we need to go to even a beta stage, or will we just want to go straight to some statement of this is generally supported or not? I can't think of any beta characteristics that I'd want to capture to make a GA statement, given that it's widely understood in the community that everybody's kind of treating this as if it's GA today. And so I don't want to do ceremony just for the sake of ceremony, but if people can think of good reasons.
I guess one other reason, Dems, maybe you can chime in, but how are we testing the CRI implementations enough in kubectl buckets?
Yes, we are. We didn't use to 2 cycles ago. We moved a bunch of them away from Docker and doing containerd at least. And the CRI folks CRIO folks have been adding tests, CI jobs, and adding to test grid as well. And I think that is so. It's probably going to take a month or 2 more to get some solid under the belt for CRIO, but containerd, yes.
Yeah, and we were working to get cgroups v2 testing done on Fedora through Cryo. So there's definitely no shortage of testing on the various paths.
But the question is, who else do we have to ask, right? Is there anybody else that we need to go ask for test coverage? Any other CRI implementations?
It's really the variance, right? It's like a CRI plus Kata, right? A CRI plus gvisor, like those various communities where we could always have more, but I don't think we would view that necessarily as release gating. And so none stand out to me, Dims, right now as things that we need to do more.
Okay. Then we are covered then.
And then the last question, if we want to queue one other meeting up on this for next week, then is volunteers to actually mechanically make it a reality. And let's queue that up for discussion on Tuesday next week, hopefully time permitting, or asynchronously there. And that comes down to like, basically, do we, I don't think the work is significant, and but it just probably touches CRI CTL and CRI API, and a minor tweak to the kubelet as we get through these.
Yeah, I can do that once we reach agreement on the next meeting, I guess.
Yeah, same here for the container D side. I'll do a pull request for the package name changes.
So maybe it's a beautiful thing, actually. Maybe Mernal or Mike, do you guys want to work together on just the KEP for the plan on this as the outcome of today's discussion? Doesn't sound like we had any major things raised on this, and it would represent 2 voices from at least 2 implementing communities.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sounds good. And I assume DIMS is available.
Yes, Mike, I can help review.
Awesome.
I didn't want to throw Dims on the spot. Anyway, I have to drop, but I appreciate you guys getting together, and I think this is important for us to.
Yeah, so next week, same time then? Does it work for folks on the call?
That works for me.
Okay, all right. I'll set up another one for next week. Thanks for joining, folks.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for setting this up, Nunal.
Thanks.